Back then, war was already tearing the heart out of Europe. Towns lay in ruin, villages stood empty, and the once quiet fields of France and Belgium had become graveyards of iron and ash. The people who lived under occupation spoke in hushed voices, for fear of the Gestapo, for fear of the SS, for fear of the unending war. And yet, even in the silence of those conquered lands, there was a sound carried on the wind. A sound that made German soldiers look over their shoulders and made weary civilians clutch their children tight. It was not the sound of tanks, nor the shriek of dive bombers. No, it was something older, more primal, the thunder of artillery. By 1943, the United States had entered the war fully, and its army, still learning the lessons of combat in North Africa, was becoming something entirely new. A modern, industrialized force, unlike anything the world had seen. The Germans prided themselves on their tanks, their Panthers, their Tigers. They boasted of their aircraft, the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs. And, to be fair, they were formidable. But they underestimated something far deadlier, something far more relentless: American artillery. In the deserts of North Africa, under the burning sun, young gunners first cut their teeth. Picture the scene: endless sand, heat waves rising, dust choking the air. German positions dug into rocky ridges, and then fire mission. The call echoed across the lines. The men of U.S. artillery batteries swung into action with a speed that stunned even seasoned observers. Heavy 105mm howitzers were loaded, breeches slammed shut, and with a thunderous crack, shells screamed into the distance. The explosions tore apart enemy strongpoints, showering steel fragments across the desert floor. The Afrika Korps, hardened veterans under Rommel himself, felt the first sting of American firepower, and they did not forget it. One German officer, captured after the fighting, admitted, "The Americans are new to war, but their artillery is already masterful. We fear it more than their tanks." And he was right. But if the desert was the classroom, Europe would be the proving ground. Fast forward to June 1944, Normandy. The greatest invasion in history had begun. Thousands of ships had carried Allied troops across the English Channel. Beaches like Omaha and Utah were soaked in blood. Yet beyond those beaches lay a far greater challenge: the bocage. The bocage country of Normandy was a nightmare. Thick hedgerows, walls of earth and tangled brush, sometimes centuries old, divided every field. For the German defenders, it was perfect terrain. Machine guns and mortars waited behind every hedge. Tanks hid in narrow lanes, ambushing anything that dared to move. For the American infantry, every step forward meant danger. And so, once again, the call went out. Artillery, fire mission. What followed was unlike anything the Germans had ever endured. The M2A1 105mm howitzers, the workhorses of the U.S. Army, belched fire across the countryside. Their shells arced overhead, bursting with shattering force among the hedgerows. The mighty 155mm long toms joined in, their booming voices echoing for miles. The Germans had a word for it: Trommelfeuer, drumfire, an unending storm of steel and fire, so relentless it seemed the very earth was being torn apart. Civilians huddled in their cellars as windows shattered and roofs caved in. Soldiers pressed themselves into muddy foxholes, covering their ears as the ground itself shook beneath them. And above it all, the American gunners worked with calm precision, plotting coordinates, adjusting fire, and hammering the enemy with scientific accuracy. One German sergeant later confessed, "We were not afraid of the American soldier with his rifle, but their artillery, it never missed. It was everywhere. It crushed us before we could even fight." And so, from the beaches of Normandy to the hedgerows of St. Lo, American artillery became the hammer that shattered German defenses. Infantry advanced where the guns had cleared the way. Tanks rolled forward through smoking craters that had once been enemy strongholds. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a nightmare. And for the Americans, it was only the beginning of unleashing hell across Europe. By the summer of 1944, the Americans had broken through the beaches of Normandy. But they found themselves locked in a brutal, grinding struggle in the hedgerows. Every field became a fortress. Every lane became a death trap. The Germans, masters of defense, were determined to bleed the Allies dry. And at the heart of this bloody maze stood the town of St. Lo, a ruined crossroads city, shattered by weeks of fighting, yet still stubbornly held by the Wehrmacht. To take St. Lo meant opening the way for the breakout from Normandy and the road to Paris. To fail meant stalemate. The task fell to the Americans, and they brought with them their artillery. On July 25, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra. It began not with tanks or infantry, but with the sky and the guns. Allied bombers roared overhead, carpet-bombing the German lines with wave after wave of destruction. But it was the U.S. field artillery that turned the battlefield into something the Germans had never imagined: an orchestrated storm of firepower. batteries of 105mm howitzers, 155mm long-toms, and even 8-inch guns opened fire in unison. The ground shook as thousands of shells rained down. The sound was not just loud, it was overwhelming. A deafening, unending thunder that seemed to tear at the soul itself. Soldiers later described it as if the very air had been set on fire. The smoke, the dust, the flashes, an entire horizon pulsing with light and flame. Now, imagine being a German soldier in those lines. You crouch in your foxhole, clutching your helmet, praying to God. The ground around you erupts again and again, showering you with earth, stone, and steel. You scream to your comrades, but your voice is swallowed by the roar of the barrage. You are deaf, blind, helpless. For minutes, then hours, it does not stop. One German survivor would later write, "It was not battle, it was annihilation. Our positions ceased to exist. The Americans did not fight us man to man. They crushed us from miles away with a fury that no courage could resist." And amid this devastation, the American infantry moved, carefully at first, inching forward, then faster, because where the artillery struck, resistance crumbled. German machine gun nests were shattered, mortars silenced, tanks overturned and burned in smoking craters. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the operation, later remarked that artillery had been the decisive factor, the hammer that broke open Normandy. St. Lo, once thought impregnable, fell within days, and with it the Germans began to retreat. But the story does not end with St. Lo. For what the Americans learned there, they would carry across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. The lessons were clear. Artillery was not just support, it was the backbone of American warfare. It was the shield for infantry, the spear against tanks, and the great equalizer when German armor and experience threatened to overwhelm. American gunners learned to fire with speed and precision. Fire missions were called in within minutes. Forward observers, crouched with infantry at the front, radioed back coordinates. And instantly, thousands of pounds of steel came screaming from the sky. The Germans soon realized there was nowhere to hide. Forests, bunkers, even concrete pillboxes, nothing could withstand the weight of American shells. One Wehrmacht lieutenant wrote bitterly in his diary, "The Americans are not soldiers, they are machine men. Their guns never rest. Their shells never end. Where we build defenses at night, by morning they are gone, swept away in fire and thunder." And the men behind the guns, ordinary farm boys, mechanics, factory workers, had become masters of destruction. They worked in teams, each man knowing his task. The loader rammed the shell, the breech slammed shut, the gun captain barked the order, the lanyard was pulled, and the cannon leapt back with a crack like the heavens splitting. Day and night, in rain and mud, they fired. Their ears rang, their bodies ached, but they knew every round might mean a life saved at the front, or a German attack stopped before it began. And with every mile the Allies advanced, the fear in German hearts grew. For they had learned a hard truth. The rifle and the tank may win battles, but it was the American artillery that won the war. And as summer gave way to autumn, a new storm was brewing. The Siegfried Line, the ancient defenses of Germany itself, awaited. And once again, U.S. artillery would be called to unleash hell. The guns of Europe never truly fell silent after Normandy. Once the Allies broke out of the hedgerows and pushed across France, the real test began, not just for infantrymen, but for the men who manned the great steel monsters of war, the artillery batteries. The Germans had once believed their own long-range guns, the dreaded 88s and railway cannons, were unmatched. But now it was the U.S. Army's turn to prove them wrong. Each day, as the front lines shifted eastward, the fields and towns of France and Belgium echoed with a rhythm that could be mistaken for thunder. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of thousands of American artillery pieces, coordinated with precision, unleashing destruction that reshaped entire battlefields in seconds. The Nazis called it drum fire. Endless, relentless, terrifying. In the autumn of 1944, as the Allies approached the Siegfried Line, Hitler's last great defensive wall, American artillery truly showed its power. The line, an endless maze of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and reinforced pillboxes, was designed to break attackers. But the Americans had learned a deadly lesson. Artillery could shatter not just walls of steel and concrete, but the will of men behind them. Each assault began the same way. At dawn, silence would stretch across the misty fields. Soldiers crouched in foxholes, holding their breath. Then the sky would split open. 1 minute, the German bunkers stood untouched. The next, they were engulfed in firestorms. The U.S. Army had perfected the use of the rolling barrage, a curtain of shells that crept forward like a living wall of fire. Infantry followed close behind, stepping into craters still smoking, pushing deeper into enemy defenses before the Germans could lift their heads. It wasn't just war. It was a symphony of destruction. Among the artillerymen was Sergeant William Carter of the 12th Field Artillery Battalion. a farm boy from Kansas. He'd grown up hearing the crack of thunder over endless plains. But now, he told his men, "Boys, when these guns speak, even the heavens stand still." They believed him. Each battery fired with a precision born of endless drills. Range tables were memorized, elevations calculated in seconds, radiums crackled with coordinates. In minutes, German strongpoints that had held for weeks were reduced to rubble. But it wasn't only firepower, it was coordination. American artillery had mastered something the Wehrmacht could never match: speed and flexibility. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, Hitler believed surprise would break the American spirit. Instead, it awakened the fury of U.S. artillery. Snow-covered forests concealed German armor pushing westward. Fog grounded Allied planes. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. But then, through sleet, snow, and chaos, the artillery spoke. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne held out not just because of their rifles, but because of the steel rain that never ceased. Every time German tanks tried to advance, American guns opened up. 105s, 155s, even massive 8-inch howitzers, tearing apart armored columns before they reached the town. Veterans would later say, the artillery was the real hero at Bastogne. But with every shell fired, there was a human hand, a human face behind it. Men worked tirelessly in freezing cold, their gloves stiff with ice, their breath fogging over the breech of each gun. They lifted shells as heavy as small children, shoulders burning, backs breaking, hearts pounding, knowing that if they faltered, American infantry would pay the price. One gunner remembered how his hands bled raw after lifting hundreds of shells in a single night. Yet he kept going. Every round, he said, was one less German who could shoot at our boys. This wasn't just about steel and fire. It was about sacrifice. By 1945, the Nazis feared American artillery more than almost anything else. German prisoners spoke of it with trembling voices. It was like the earth itself hated us, one captured soldier admitted. Another whispered, "When your guns began, we knew we were already dead." The truth was undeniable. American artillery had become a force of nature. And yet, behind the fury, there was strategy, discipline, and the quiet courage of men who knew their role might never be sung in glory songs. The infantry charged, the tanks roared, the planes soared, but it was the gunners, the unseen giants, who made victory possible. Every shell they fired was a promise kept, a promise to the men in the foxholes, a promise to the families waiting back home, and a promise that tyranny would not stand. By early 1945, the German Reich was crumbling. Cities smoldered, bridges lay shattered, and every village from the Ardennes to the Rhine bore scars of war. Yet, even cornered, the Nazis fought with desperate ferocity. Hitler had promised his people that the fatherland was impenetrable. But the thunder of U.S. artillery was about to prove him wrong. The Rhine River, wide, swift, and heavily defended, was the final natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Its banks bristled with pillboxes, trenches, and concealed artillery. The Wehrmacht believed no army could cross without catastrophic losses. But American artillery commanders had spent months preparing. They studied maps, calculated trajectories, measured distances with meticulous care. Every town, every crossroads, every possible defensive point on the German side of the Rhine was plotted into the firing tables. And when the time came, the sky erupted. On the night of March 22, 1945, the U.S. Third Army under General George Patton launched its assault near Oppenheim. Before the first boats touched the water, American artillery unleashed a barrage so overwhelming, German defenders described it as if the world itself had exploded. One survivor muttered, "We were not fighting men, we were fighting the earth." Shells rained for hours. The night sky glowed with constant flashes. Bridges collapsed. Ammunition dumps vanished in fireballs. German artillery was silenced before it could even answer. By dawn, the crossing was secure, and the Rhine, once thought untouchable, lay behind the U.S. Army. Meanwhile, further north at Remagen, another miracle unfolded. On March 7, 1945, American troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge, still intact, before German engineers could destroy it. It was artillery that ensured the bridgehead held. For 10 long days, American gunners poured fire across the river, smashing German counterattacks that tried desperately to reclaim the span. Infantry clung to their bridgehead, engineers raced to reinforce it, and above it all, artillery roared like an unbroken promise. With every shell, the path into Germany widened. By now, German soldiers spoke of American artillery with dread. Whole divisions were pinned down before they could maneuver. Columns of panzers, once feared across Europe, were reduced to twisted hulks in burning fields. By the spring of 1945, the sound of U.S. artillery had become the drumbeat of Germany's collapse. From the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, to the shattered bridges of the Rhine, to the heart of the fatherland itself, the guns never stopped. In April, as the Allies closed in from the west, the Soviets pressed from the east. Berlin was surrounded, burning, screaming. The once proud Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, exhausted, broken, and terrified. And still the shells fell. American artillery flattened defensive belts, shredded roadblocks, and silenced any attempt at resistance. For every counterattack Hitler demanded, batteries of American guns answered with fire that turned hope into ash. In those final weeks, German officers spoke openly of despair. Many had fought since Poland, since France, since the long years on the Eastern Front. But never, not even against the Red Army, had they experienced such relentless, organized, devastating firepower. For them, artillery was no longer a weapon, it was a sentence. And then silence began to spread where fire had once roared. On May 8, 1945, the guns grew quiet. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Men who had fired tens of thousands of rounds at last laid their hands on the cooling barrels of their guns. They stared at the empty skies, the ruined towns, the wide rivers that had once seemed impossible to cross. They had done their duty. And in doing so, they had ended the terror of the Third Reich. The legacy of U.S. artillery was not just destruction. It was liberation. It was the chance for millions to live free again. Ask the people of France who saw their villages cleared of occupation. Ask the Dutch who watched Allied guns silence the V-2 launch sites raining terror on London. Ask the starving, the imprisoned, the survivors of camps who lived to see liberation. They knew the thunder of American artillery was not the end. It was the beginning. And for the men who served, the memories never faded. Some carried the ringing of the guns in their ears for the rest of their lives. Some could never forget the smell of cordite, the sight of ruined towns, or the weight of knowing each shell carried life or death. They joked sometimes, calling themselves the King's Men, for artillery had long been called the king of battle. But behind the humor was pride, pride that they had stood, fired, and endured. The Nazis were terrified, and for good reason. Because when U.S. artillery unleashed hell in Europe, it did more than defeat an army. It broke an empire. It ended a nightmare. And it proved once again that in war the thunder of the guns could speak louder than any tyrant's lies. And that, my friends, is the story of how U.S. artillery became the nightmare of the German army in World War II. If you felt the weight of this history, if you walked with me through those frozen fields and burning towns, then I invite you to join me again. Please, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button if this story moved you, and share it so others may remember the sacrifices, the courage, and the fire that shaped our world. Until next time, thank you for listening. and may we never forget the lessons written in fire and silence.